She didn't hesitate. As the cameras rolled and the lights blazed, she stood her ground like a seasoned warrior stepping into familiar territory. Her expression was calm, but her voice carried the weight of steel. She had come prepared, not with scripted lines or rehearsed talking points, but with the raw, unfiltered truth. Every word she spoke sliced through the noise, shattering illusions built by years of celebrity commentary and media spin. She wasn't interested in drama or theatrics. She wasn't there to trade insults or dance around facts. What she delivered was a masterclass in composure under pressure. She had no cue cards, no team of writers whispering in her ear, just her mind, her principles, and a deep understanding of what mattered to everyday Americans. She laid it out clearly, with pinpoint accuracy, addressing the contradictions, the elitism, and the moral posturing that so many had grown tired of. There was power in her restraint. Where others might have raised their voice or cracked under the weight of confrontation, she stayed focused, letting the truth speak for itself. Her confidence wasn't theatrical, it was earned. She had done her homework, she brought receipts, and she didn't waste a second delivering them. With each sentence, she painted a picture of two Americas, one built on hard work, integrity, and values, and another propped up by illusions, fame, and disconnected ideologies. As she spoke, the energy in the room shifted. Viewers watching from home could feel it. Social media lit up with comments like, "She's saying what we've all been thinking," and finally, someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth. She didn't just respond, she dismantled. Every vague claim and shallow jab thrown her way was met with sharp clarity. She re-centered the conversation, bringing it back to what actually mattered. Not the noise, not the celebrity, but the facts, the people, the country. The most powerful moment came not from volume or aggression, but from sheer authenticity. She didn't try to impress. She didn't try to charm. She didn't need to. She represented something far stronger, a grounded voice with a deep respect for truth. In an age where spin is currency, her blunt honesty was priceless. She didn't try to win with personal attacks or clever comebacks. She simply told the truth, and the truth did the work for her. The more she spoke, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a one-time moment, it was a turning point. People saw through the manufactured outrage, the shallow takes, and the performative politics. They saw someone who wasn't playing a role, but instead stood firmly in what she believed, unwilling to bend or be bullied. Her tone was calm, but her words carried force. She exposed the disconnect between public posturing and real-world consequences, between speeches made for applause and the realities faced by Americans outside the spotlight. And she did it all, without a single stumble. There was no flinching, no dodging, no deflecting. She answered questions directly. She didn't rely on cliches or vague generalities. Instead, she brought the conversation back to the ground, where real people live and work and raise families. She spoke of principles, not popularity, of duty, not drama. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her conviction made everyone listen. The broadcast may have started with the usual buzz, but it quickly became something else entirely. It became a reckoning. Her words cut through years of media narratives, like a blade through fog. She didn't need to say much because what she said carried weight. Her delivery wasn't just powerful, it was surgical, controlled, precise. She had full command of her space, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. In that moment, she became more than just a guest or a commentator. She became a symbol for those who've felt silenced, misrepresented, and dismissed. She didn't just challenge the narrative, she redefined it. With poise and purpose, she stepped forward and said what others were too afraid to say. And for those watching, it was more than refreshing. It was a long overdue truth bomb dropped right in the middle of a conversation that desperately needed it. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. What started as a confident presence quickly unraveled into visible discomfort, as if the foundation beneath his beliefs was shifting in real time. The more she spoke, the more the tension rose, not from aggression or personal attacks, but from the sheer pressure of unfiltered truth. Every sentence she delivered was calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't just what she said. It was the way she said it. Controlled. Measured. Devastating. The camera caught every detail. A tight jaw. Restless fingers. A flicker of the eyes searching for an escape route in a debate that had suddenly turned against him. The poise that once seemed unshakable began to crack, and what emerged wasn't the figure of authority once expected, but someone clearly out of their depth, exposed not by hostility, but by precision. There was no yelling, no need for dramatics, just a steady stream of facts that couldn't be spun or dismissed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gloat. She simply laid down argument after argument with quiet intensity. She asked the questions. Others were too afraid to voice, the kind that don't just demand answers, they demand accountability. And with each one, the discomfort grew. The composure that had seemed so ironclad at the start of the broadcast melted away, replaced with defensiveness, frustration, and flashes of outright panic. Viewers saw it clearly. It was like watching a public performance unravel, layer by layer, until only the raw, unscripted truth remained. What happened next wasn't some heated explosion. It was far more telling than that. It was a slow-motion unraveling, a meltdown measured in stammers, in rising irritation, in emotional outbursts that had no place in a rational conversation. The polished veneer was gone. The media-trained responses had failed. All that was left was a man grappling with the sudden realization that he was no longer in control of the narrative. Online, it was instant. Clips circulated within minutes. The contrast was so sharp, so undeniably clear, that audiences couldn't look away. Social media feeds were flooded with side-by-side reactions. One person calm, composed, and factual, the other flustered, defensive, and visibly shaken. Memes exploded, hashtags trended. People didn't just watch, they replayed, dissected, and shared with captions like, "She broke him without breaking a sweat." What made the moment even more powerful was that she never raised her voice. She didn't lean into theatrics. She didn't mock, ridicule, or sneer. Instead, she relied on truth, pure, confident, and unmoved by the antics unraveling across from her. She kept her eyes forward, voice steady, making it all the more obvious who had lost control. And the more flustered he became, the stronger she looked. The more emotional he got, the more focused she became. It was like watching a mirror shatter. The image that had been cultivated for so long, of authority, knowledge, conviction, crumbled under the weight of simple facts and fearless questioning. There was nowhere to hide. Not behind reputation, not behind applause, not behind familiar slogans. The spotlight, once a source of comfort, now magnified every crack, every stumble, every sign of insecurity. She didn't have to point it out. The unraveling was obvious to everyone watching. People could feel the shift. One minute it was a conversation. The next, it was a reckoning. Not because someone was attacked, but because someone had finally been held accountable in a space where they'd grown used to unquestioned praise. It wasn't anger that brought the collapse. It was the calm force of truth meeting someone who had never been truly challenged. The contrast made it impossible to ignore. The person once expected to dominate the discussion had instead become the example of what happens when public image collides with actual substance. She hadn't just held her own, she had flipped the entire conversation, exposing not just contradictions, but the fragility of opinions built on hollow foundations. By the end of the segment, it was unmistakable. Viewers weren't just reacting to what was said, they were reacting to what was revealed. A complete unraveling, live and unedited, triggered not by rage or disrespect, but by calm, confident truth. And as it unfolded, the internet watched in disbelief, witnessing a live moment of reality that no amount. In the heat of the courtroom, emotions swirled through the heavy air, a thick tension hanging over every word spoken. One figure, long known for poise and presence, could no longer contain the internal storm brewing within. The words hurled by an outspoken critic struck deep, crafted not simply as political jabs, but as personal attacks meant to provoke, belittle, and humiliate. Every sentence, laced with venom, challenged not just actions, but very character and legacy. The pressure built slowly at first, a clenching jaw here, a tightening grip on the chair there. But as the criticisms grew sharper, the dam finally broke. The moment wasn't theatrical. It wasn't calculated. It was raw humanity on full display. Eyewitnesses could barely believe what they were seeing. Voice cracking, face flushed with anger and sadness, the defenses crumbled. A towering figure once seen as untouchable was now visibly shaking, struggling to find breath between fractured sentences. Words failed as emotion flooded in, overpowering the courtroom's sterile procedure. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing up against the humiliation, the betrayal, the overwhelming weight of years spent building something that was now being casually torn apart in public. The audience, a mix of journalists, court officials, and casual spectators, fell silent, captivated by the scene unfolding before them. Cameras that were supposed to remain neutral seemed to lean, in desperate to capture the human moment, a man, stripped of reputation, standing exposed before the world. Some who had entered the room with skepticism or cynicism found themselves unable to look away, watching not an actor or a public figure, but a person forced to confront brutal words without the armor of fame or fortune. Each attempt to compose himself was a battle. Breaths were drawn in sharp and shallow, hands wiped furiously at eyes that betrayed every effort at stoicism. It was the purest kind of breakdown, not for show, not for sympathy, but because the emotional dam could no longer withstand the relentless battering it had endured. Lawyers exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the eruption continue. Opposing counsel, sensing the vulnerability, seemed caught between strategic advantage and human discomfort. Some of the harshest comments weren't just criticisms of public actions, but cut at personal integrity, at deep values held close over a lifetime. Being portrayed as a caricature, as a villain in a story crafted by political enemies, was more than an insult. It was a distortion of truth, a rewriting of a personal and professional history that had been hard-fought and passionately lived. The sense of injustice was almost tangible, radiating from every shaking movement and every broken word. Meanwhile, across the room, some faces remained stone-cold, indifferent to the emotional collapse taking place before them. In their eyes, it was a weakness to be exploited, a crack in the armor they had so eagerly been chipping away at. But for others, even those who might have disagreed with the figure's politics or public stances, there was an undeniable human resonance in the moment. It was a reminder that beyond headlines and talking points, there are still individuals who bleed, break, and bear wounds invisible to the public eye. The judge, sitting high above the fray, maintained a professional facade, but occasionally glanced down with a mixture of concern and restraint. This wasn't a part of the process that any courtroom manual could prepare for. It was the collision of law and human frailty, and the sterile, controlled environment of the court felt almost too fragile to contain the rawness bursting forth. No prepared statements, no rehearsed speeches, no polished publicist-driven responses could have captured the sheer authenticity of the collapse. It was painful, uncomfortable, and yet profoundly real. A life spent mastering words, appearances, and performances was, for this brief and brutal window of time, stripped down to its bare trembling core. There was no winning this moment, no strategic recovery or spin. The only thing left was the truth of what it felt like to be battered by a world that no longer cared to understand, only to judge. In that courtroom, under the brutal glare of the public spotlight, the mask fell away completely. What remained was not a headline, not a brand, not a persona, just a battered soul fighting to reclaim a shred of dignity in a world that had, for the moment, decided he was easier to mock than to understand. The courtroom, already thick with tension, shifted palpably when a large stack of documents was produced with deliberate care. There was an audible shift among the crowd, a collective leaning forward, a drawing in of breath, as the evidence, previously unseen and unexpected, was introduced into the record. These weren't just casual notes or vague references. They were cold, hard receipts, organized meticulously, each page threatening to upend the narrative that had been so confidently spun by opponents. Every paper, every printed message, every time-stamped communication was a weapon. For weeks, if not months, accusations had been flung with reckless abandon, painting a picture that suited a certain agenda. The story had been told and retold so many times that it had begun to harden into something resembling fact. But this new cache of evidence cracked that illusion wide open, exposing gaps, inconsistencies, and outright fabrications. The legal team, with an almost theatrical precision, began walking the court through each key piece. Emails showed conversations previously denied. Financial documents revealed truths that had been spun into lies. Screenshots of private exchanges illuminated a version of events far different from the one broadcast on talk shows and social media. The cold reality of evidence and emotionless unyielding had a devastating effect. Every highlighted paragraph, every circled date, stripped away the comforting fog of speculation, replacing it with undeniable reality. Spectators, including seasoned reporters who thought they had seen it all, began whispering among themselves. Journalists scribbled frantically, recognizing the moment for what it was, a turning point that few had anticipated. This wasn't simply a rebuttal. It was a strategic demolition of an entire narrative carefully constructed to tear a person down. Instead of relying on fiery speeches or emotional appeals, the strategy was ruthless in its simplicity. Let the truth in black and white do the talking. Opposing counsel who had spent so much energy framing the case around public perception visibly shifted in their seats. Their earlier confidence seemed to wilt under the weight of undeniable facts. They tried to object, to slow the momentum, but the judge, sensing the significance of the evidence, allowed the process to unfold. There was no grandstanding, no shouting, just the slow, methodical unveiling of reality, page after damning page. Each document felt like a strike against the brittle armor of deception. Claims that had once seemed plausible now looked absurd when juxtaposed against actual records. Statements that had once generated applause or outrage on partisan platforms crumbled under the cold scrutiny of evidence. The contrast was staggering. The loud accusations of weeks past versus the silent, crushing weight of the truth now on full display. Even those aligned with the opposition could no longer deny the power of the evidence laid bare before them. In a space where spin and half-truths often ruled the day, the emergence of hard facts created an uncomfortable but necessary reckoning. The courtroom no longer belonged to those who shouted the loudest. It belonged to those who could prove what they claimed. Every detail mattered. It wasn't just the content of the documents, but their authenticity, their careful organization, their irrefutable connection to the events in question. No tricks, no smoke and mirrors, just reality, laid out in a way that demanded to be acknowledged. The audience wasn't just witnessing a defense. They were witnessing a dismantling, a quiet but merciless deconstruction of a false story that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. Throughout the process, the atmosphere remained electric. Every new revelation tightened the noose around the lies that had been so casually disseminated before. Allies who had once cheered from the sidelines now found themselves silent, confronted with proof that could not be argued away with clever talking points or emotional manipulation. The air grew heavier with each document presented, a silent understanding passing through the room. The ground was shifting beneath their feet. It became increasingly clear that the attempt to destroy a reputation wasn't just misguided. It was built on a foundation of distortions, exaggerations, and deliberate omissions that could not withstand serious scrutiny. This wasn't just a legal strategy. It was a masterclass in the power of preparation, patience, and truth. In a world that often rewards volume over veracity, the presentation of undeniable receipts cut through the noise with a blade of cold clarity. Facts were placed above feelings, evidence above ego, and reality above reputation. The moment of confrontation had been building slowly, a simmering tension just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. For days, the courtroom had been a battleground of words and strategies, with accusations flying fast and loose. At the center, Of it all stood the figure who had delivered the most cutting blows, someone whose remarks had ignited a firestorm, their words dripping with a certain ruthless calculation. The decision to finally call out those remarks directly wasn't made lightly. It was a tactical move, but it was also deeply personal, driven by a need to challenge the spread of falsehoods and protect what had been unjustly tarnished. The remarks themselves weren't casual criticisms. They were sharp, brutal, and deeply personal attacks. They hadn't targeted policy or projects or work. They had struck at character, at personal values, at the very core of a person's identity. They were designed not to critique but to humiliate, not to debate but to destroy. In this arena, where image and reputation were as much at stake as legal outcomes, such remarks carried the power to redefine public perception almost instantly. When the legal team rose to address these comments, the shift in tone was immediate. There was no hesitation, no half measures. They named the attacks for what they were: malicious lies, carefully crafted to tear down, to delegitimize, and to poison the well of public opinion. They spoke with a calm intensity that left little room for misunderstanding. Every word was chosen with precision, laying out how these remarks had twisted reality and weaponized it for personal and political gain. The court listened in near total silence, the usual murmur of side conversations and paper shuffling completely absent. The accusation wasn't just that the remarks had been cruel, it was that they had been knowingly false, a deliberate attempt to smear someone's name without regard for truth or consequence. It wasn't about heated emotions or political disagreement. It was about the line between fair criticism and outright character assassination being crossed without hesitation. Evidence was cited meticulously. Past interviews were quoted, private communications were referenced, timelines were mapped out to show exactly how the misleading narrative had been constructed. It was an unmasking, a moment when the veneer of political bravado was peeled away, to reveal the cold, calculated cruelty beneath. The words that had once seemed spontaneous and impassioned were shown to be part of a larger strategy, a strategy built on misrepresentation and personal destruction. Observers who had come into the courtroom expecting another day of procedural posturing now found themselves witnessing a far more gripping drama. Journalists, sensing the gravity of the moment, scribbled notes furiously. Some leaned forward in their seats, recognizing that what was happening wasn't just legal maneuvering. It was a direct challenge to the culture of casual slander that had infected so much of public discourse. The person whose remarks were being called out sat quietly, showing little reaction on the surface. But the tension was visible, a stiffness in posture, a slight narrowing of the eyes. The impact of being publicly named and challenged could not be easily shrugged off. Once accusations are laid bare under the harsh light of truth, they lose their power, and those who spread them must reckon with the consequences. There was a righteousness to the moment, a sense that finally, someone was refusing to accept the erosion of truth as just another part of the game. It wasn't about scoring points or winning a news cycle. It was about standing up against a tide of cynicism and cruelty that had gone unchallenged for too long. In an age when so much could be destroyed with a single viral clip or a cutting headline, this stand for integrity felt almost radical. The atmosphere remained heavy as the courtroom digested what had been said. This wasn't just a defense against slander, it was a broader indictment of a system that too often rewards the loudest and the most vicious, rather than the most honest. The challenge laid down was clear. Lies would not be allowed to stand. Unopposed, reputations would not be allowed to be shredded without a fight. The call-out didn't rely on anger or theatrics. It relied on facts, clarity, and moral authority. It reminded everyone watching, inside the courtroom and beyond its walls, that words matter, that truth matters, and that attacking someone's character with deliberate falsehoods is not just cruel, it is deeply wrong. In that moment, the court became not just a place of legal reckoning, but a place where accountability was finally, forcefully demanded.